This is interval 6, which means that we have gone through 6 12-section arcs of presentation. And after each of these arcs of presentation, there is an interval. An interval is a pause that refreshes, to usurp the Coca-Cola slogan. But before the pause that refreshes was a slogan, intervals were known in music as expressive presences that allowed for the notes to come forth into form. Without a context of silent background, notes and their formations do not have a chance to exist, and further, they do not have any way to link resonantly and make gestalts. But before music had intervals, the primary discovery of interval was due to a historical person named Siddhartha, the original Buddha. He could sit intense enough and focus fine enough to take a moment of thought, the atom of thought, called a bodhicitta, and he fractionated, like supersonic, hypersonic yogi, he fractionated moment of thought and discovered that it had 16 parts. But because of the nature of the way in which the universe allows for reality to record, only 8 of those parts were distinct. The other 8 were never distinct. They always occurred as a trill. And when he looked closer, he saw that the 8 parts that could be made distinct out of a moment of thought were like radial spikes of light, and that this was the noble truths done in a Four Noble Truths done in a complete cycle of this and that, of positive and negative, and that the Four Noble Truths as a basis of existential reality were always doubled because they presented themselves and then unpresented themselves, and one had to take the entire double cycle together. But that the other 8 parts of a moment of thought could never be differentially distinct. They, in fact, never existed, which is why they could not be distinct. And that those 8 were, in fact, the 8-fold path. So that some 2,500 years ago, one of the most powerful yogis on this planet, or any particular planet, he's a marquee player in the universe, no matter where he goes. I mean, in any star system, if you headline the Buddha, you'll draw infinite crowds of sentient beings wanting to be enlightened. The Buddha saw that the bodhicitta, the atom of thought, the moment of where nature comes to a still wholeness, for a moment of thought is a still point in nature. It's the only stillness that there is in nature. Thought is the only stillness that there is in nature. Everything else in nature is ceaselessly changing, restlessly ambitious, purposefully in motion. And that entire waterbug choreography comes only to a place where the critique silences itself and the movement is at the very center of thought, a moment of complete presence. Now, before the historical Buddha, that moment was called in yogic tradition the bindu, or a bindu. It was a focus so powerful that it collapsed in upon itself like a miniature black hole. No movement escaped from its density. And like a microscopic pinprick black hole, a super yogi could bring all of nature into a vanishing. But before that pinprick vanished, its last form was a 16-part gestalt, 8 parts of which were always distinct, always had intervals. And another 8 parts they had no intervals because they had been absorbed into the intervals themselves and were the interval. It took a long time. The Buddha had to teach for 45 years. And it was only after several decades of teaching and training and patiently raising people from being teenagers to being 40-year-olds mature enough to finally get it. And the first person that got it was named Mahakasyapa, Big Kasyapa, who's at the window now. Kasyapa was the one who smiled at the flower sermon. The Buddha, when he got into his early 80s, late 70s, was magnificently open. He held nothing back. And one time to the collected monks there, he just simply held up a flower. And out of the thousands of people that were there to hear him, because he'd become very famous by that time, after 45 years of headlining in all over northern India, the crowd was big. And the only person who smiled was Mahakasyapa. He understood. The flower had 16 petals. You could see it all, but you could only see it all if you were able to compose perfection and completeness and conscious nothingness at the same time. And it's always funny. Not ha-ha funny, it's always peculiar, paradoxically, weirdly, amusingly, gorgeously, uproariously funny. Because the body doesn't get it. And the mind doesn't get it. The body loves to respond to what's there. It says, mine. The mind loves to respond to what's not there. It says, mine. But the spirit only responds to reality. When what's there and what isn't there hold hands, and the spirit says, kiss. The Buddha saw that a moment of thought has a structure, an 8-part structure, that only is an 8-part structure by virtue of intervaling. That were the intervals not to be a context, not only surrounding those aspects that count, but enfolding them so that the definition of things was not the edge of the things, but the resonant openness which allowed them to be. And so in this education, which is a 3rd millennial AD presentation of wisdom, meant to recalibrate and recast civilization completely. How ambitious. The presentation is in 8 parts, 8 sections that can be named and numbered, like nature, ritual, myth, symbol, vision, art, history, science. They can be named. They can be studied. There's a progression of development that familiarizes one, and so one knows these, not just as subjects, but as areas, as realms that have an objectivity to them, but they are all punctuated, each and every one of them punctuated by a context, a background that cannot be designated. And so one talks about it as the interval. And this is the 6th interval. But in order to keep an interface possibility in our education, the intervals are characterized by classic books, classic authors who are in the Hall of Fame of interval presenters. And this interval 6 is that of a woman, one of the greatest poets of any age, Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson could have smiled at the Buddhist flower sermon. She would have not only got it, she would have been able to blow a kiss to it. She's very feminine, very much a woman. But she was so accurate in her reality. She understood both the body's need to respond to what is there and the mind's need to play with what is not there, and the spirit's love of the hand holding between the two. And that transformation into that cinching into something completely different. For the spirit is not a thing like the body or the mind. The body and the mind are things. They are things. They're very much things. The body is an external thing. The mind's an interior thing. One can talk about it this way. They're objective exactly in this way. The spirit is not a thing. It's more comprehensive than the dichotomy external-internal. It embraces external-internal completely all the time. Has no trouble whatsoever. In fact, the body and the mind, when they get into huffs, into these polarized discontinuities, into these disjunctive arguments where they're not talking to each other, the spirit is the only mediator. Or we would use the term today, which actually is a Hellenistic term that was used by St. John, that the Holy Spirit is a counselor. In St. John, Jesus says, I have to go because if I don't go, then the counselor won't be able to come and make all things possible. Long as I'm here, you think I can do it for you. I do it as an example, not for you. Whereas your own Holy Spirit, which is your real counselor, your spirit can come and get the body and mind talking to each other, and out of that reconciliation, out of that counseling comes this cinching, this magical, conscious explosion of reality. That not only is the world of the form possible, not only is the non-realm of the non-formed not possible, but that both together do a complementation. Emily Dickinson is a 19th century American yogi. But unlike a Hindu yogi who vanishes into the Bindu. She's rather like the Mahayana bodhisattva who keeps sticking around even though they've completely vanished, and notices after a while that the flowers and the bees and the clouds respond as if you were still there. And by taking them at their honest response, one comes to understand that you are in fact there, but in a completely different way. That you're there spiritually and not physically or mentally, only or together. One is there spiritually. And it's only by the resonances of consciousness and nature playing together that one becomes aware that you're still functioning. And that this is very curious. It's an Alice in Wonderland. And by the way, Alice in Wonderland is a production of the same time period as Emily Dickinson. She is a conscious Alice. If Alice had been a Zen master in Wonderland, she would have, well, maybe she was, Emily Dickinson. It's very difficult. When you are born in Amherst, Massachusetts in 1830, to come in not just red hot and not just white hot, but invisibly hot. Like a pure point of reality that ultimately can absorb and radiate in the entire spectrum. She had that quality. Let's go to some early kind of poem of hers just for a second. This is from the 3-volume Harvard Poems of Emily Dickinson. Almost 2,000 poems. This is number 271. It's very difficult to read Emily Dickinson because she does not work with rhyme and meter. Her rhythm is not the scanned proportions of a Roman or Greek prosody. She has the articulate rhythms of the spacings of the spiritually real. To the best of my ability, here's this poem. A solemn thing it was, I said, a woman, white, to be and where, if God should count me fit. Her blameless mystery. A timid thing to drop a life into the mystic well, too plummetless, that it come back eternity until I pondered how the bliss would look. And would it feel as big when I could take it in my hand as hovering, seen through fog, and then the size of this small life, the sages call it small, swelled like horizons in my breast. And I sneered softly, small? When you write things like this during the beginnings of the Civil War, you can see that you're not going to make too many friends. The clumsy, ambitious rituals of the mask wearers has no proscenium on which to display their requirements, their desires. She wasn't there for them in that way, ever. And so it was very rare that somebody could get her because there wasn't anyone to get. There wasn't anything to get. One had to be there with her resolutely, and then it was overwhelming. Just a couple times in her life she traveled. She went to Boston, she went to Philadelphia, just a couple of times. Most of her life she spent in the house on the property that her father owned in Amherst, Massachusetts. It was, as someone said, her laboratory. It was her experimental place to explore her spirit. The artistic person who not only she was, but who exactly she wasn't at one and the same time. Her family was very prominent. They owned one of the largest houses, and though for a while they lost it to some kind of financial setback, it was soon, when she was 25, bought again, and this huge house. Her father was quite well known. He was the treasurer of Amherst there in Amherst, Massachusetts. Amherst has not only Amherst, the academy and the college, but it has the University of Massachusetts, and nearby in Northampton, Massachusetts is Smith College, and so it's an academic intellectual center, which is cut off. It's cut off by an enormous dam and reservoir lake complex so that Boston and Worcester and Providence, Rhode Island, which are on the coast, not that far away, are very far away because of this open space. There are no towns there for a long ways. And on the other side of Amherst are all these western Massachusetts mountain ranges that are good only for ski slopes or for places for people to go and retreat, like Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Or for interesting 19th century American literateurs who were transcendent to be born in and grow up, like Oliver Wendell Holmes from Pittsfield, or William Cullen Bryant, just north of Amherst. So that Amherst is cut off east and west. It's isolated. It's just a little cultural valley area. And if one went north, one would go into the open wilderness of Vermont, whose big places like Bennington and Brattleboro are just little villages, and everything else is just strings of long forested mountains up into Canada. The only perimeter is if one went south, and if one goes south, right away one gets to a different mentality extremely fast. You would come to the complex that's there that extends like some kind of suburban comma from New York City, that goes as this geographical comma across the face of Connecticut and ends up in southern Massachusetts. One goes through Bridgeport, Connecticut, and New Haven, and up through Hartford, and up into the bottom of Springfield, Massachusetts. And that whole swath is all a suburban resonance of New York City because it's so powerful, always has been powerful. Completely different. The New York City is completely different from the New England. New York and Boston are totally different. They really don't relate. So Providence, Boston are completely themselves looking up to the Atlantic, and everything else in that comma looks to New York City. And so Amherst had this cultivated, isolated feeling. It was like an intellectual summer camp that was pleasantly forgotten by any and everybody until they would just come and visit, or they would send children to be schooled there, and That was it. And that was her whole universe. It was the entire cosmos for Emily Dickinson. In one of the biggest, grandest houses in lilac flower bordered yards with white picket fence, that was the target at which this hypersonic yogi lived most of her life. Almost too sensitive for words, except with the proviso that one learns winged words. Here's another poem, just to give you the sense, the flow. She's a woman, homely, but middling well-to-do, very proper, approached certainly by men. This poem. He put the belt around my life. I heard the buckle snap and turned away, imperial. My lifetime folding up, deliberate as a duke would do, a kingdom's title deed. Henceforth a dedicated sort, a member of the cloud, yet not too far to come to call and do the little toils that make the circuit of the rest, and to deal occasional smiles to lives that stoop to notice mine, and kindly ask it in. Whose invitation know you not? For whom I must decline. It's a who do you think you are from a master yogi. What kind of a thing do you imagine that you are stooping to notice a thing called me? Is there anything true in that whole drama? There not only is no substance, there is no resonance. She had this incredibly poignant quality of simply puncturing the illusions and not noticing at all the delusions that cloyingly make it possible for people to ignorantly just get by. It's completely different if you're on tribal level vis-a-vis nature, then that kind of ritual comportment is a survival habit. Then you need to do it. Then you follow the animals because they're the only source of life, or you follow the plants because you need to stay alive. On the tribal level, in the mythic flow of feeling, one needs to get parallel with nature's process. But consciousness as a process, as a magical, visionary process, is disjunctive to nature. It never touches it. As soon as consciousness comes into play, it doesn't play with nature, unless there be some reality that reconciles them, like a spiritual participant who agrees to be in nature even though not of it. And so the world of the spirit, not antithetical to the world of nature, but in a complementarity whose polarized version is disjunctive. As long as you try to objectify the spirit as a thing, it doesn't get along with nature at all because it has no way to interface with it. The more that one emphasizes that the person is a thing, the less reality that there is. Reality goes right out the window, through the doors, evaporates through the roof. Not going to happen at all. The great Chinese landscape painter, the Rembrandt of Chinese landscapes, Ma Yuan, once drew a house in one of his landscapes, a very large palatial house. And I once blew up a photograph of Ma Yuan's section of this great landscape scroll from the Southern Sung landscape tradition. And one could see in this blow up that none of the lines that made the beams of the house touched. The house was a gestalt of a cloud-like openness that the members of the floors and the roofs and the walls never touched anywhere. They were all in approximation, but they never touched. Two of the architects that got this in early 20th century Pasadena were the Green brothers. And when they built the Gamble House on Orange Grove Avenue in the early 1900s, they sent this is Procter and Gamble's. They sent the soap magnets to Europe for a year, and they built the house, so when they came back, it was all finished. The motif of the house is the cloud, the Japanese cloud motif, which is the Japanese Mahayana version in its Shingon Yogacara version of the way in which reality is a resonance of choreographed cooperation of the real, and nothing touches. The posts and beams never touch. So that when you get the Gamble House, you feel the cloud-like openness of its structure. I remember once, about 20 years ago, trying to photograph the Gamble House surreptitiously. You're not allowed, the docents, no, you cannot photograph this, but I was surreptitiously trying to sneak details so I could do this, and of course the emulsion turned bright magenta, the curse of heat. But I remember coming out of the house thinking I had gotten it, and I was kinesthetically scuffing clouds with my feet. I thought, I've got it. I can show it. I can do a monograph on the Gamble House as a Zen structure. I wasn't thinking of fame. I was just thinking of the impossibility of trying to poetically disclose this mystery, this secret. The Ma Yuan House doesn't come together. Emily Dickinson's poetry is like that. It's right here. Many a phrase has the English language. I have heard but one. Low as the laughter of the cricket, loud as the thunder's tongue, murmuring like old Caspian choirs when the tide's a lull, saying itself in new inflection like a whippoorwill, breaking in bright orthography on my simple sleep, thundering its prospective till I stir and weep, not for the sorrow done me, but the push of joy. Say it again, Saxon. Hush, only to me. It's the poignancy of exactly you, who are both there and not there, not only at one and the same time and one and the same place, but at all the times and all the places that ever could be. The Spirit is not in space. It's not in time. It's not in time-space. It's a differential form, and its there-ness is there in infinite possibility. So that the defining lines around a person are the unnumerable, the instoppable I'm using perverted English now. The innumerable, unstoppable possibilities. She has, towards the end of her life, poems which become so penetrative, so illustrative of all of this. Listen to, this is poem 1260, long ways later. Because that you are going and never coming back, and I, however absolute, may overlook your track. Because that death is final, however first it be, this instant be suspended above mortality. Significant that each has lived, the other to detect. Discovery not God himself could now annihilate. Eternity. Presumption, the instant I perceive that you, who were existence, yourself forgot to live. The life that is will then have been a thing I never knew. As paradise fictitious, until the realm of you, the life that is to be, to me, a residence too plain, unless in my Redeemer's face I recognize your own. Of immortality who doubts, he may exchange with me, curtailed by your obscuring face, of everything but he. Of heaven and hell I also yield the right to reprehend, to whoso would commute this face for his less priceless friend. If God is love, as he admits, we think that he must be, because he is a jealous God. He tells us certainly, if all is possible with him, as he besides concedes, he will refund us finally our confiscated gods. It's almost too much for late 20th century refined, absurd, joyous people to hear her, much less 150 years ago. She lived in a world, in a realm, which was like antiquarian picture postcard New England village. She was surrounded by people. Her own family were church-going members. Every Sunday, ritually, New England village life, which as hypersonic yogi, she found that there was nothing real whatsoever in any of the choreography of their lives, except their lack of recognition of their spiritual person who she knew and loved and wanted to vibrate with. Let's take a break and we'll come back. This photograph illustrates this poem by Emily Dickinson, one of two, which I will read for you. This poem orients itself towards, the second poem orients itself towards emptiness, which is different from death. Death is a punctuation to integral existence. Emptiness is an intervaling punctuation of differential form. Here's the poem vis-a-vis death. There's a certain slant of light on winter afternoons that oppresses like the weight of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us. We can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it anything. 'Tis the seal, despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. The second poem, the snow. It sifts from leaden sieves. It powders all the wood. It fills with alabaster wool the wrinkles on the road. It makes an even face of mountain and of plain, unbroken forehead from the east until the east again. It reaches to the fence and wraps it rail by rail till it is lost in fleeces. It flings a crystal veil, one stump and stack and stem, the summer's empty room, acres of seams where harvests were recordless but for them. It ruffles wrists of posts as ankles of a queen, then stills its artisans like ghosts, denying they have been. There's all the difference in the world between death and the vanishing into emptiness. That emptiness is creative. It's creative because it is the intervaling. It's the reality that allows for return. Death ends life. Emptiness is an interval that permits a rebirth. What is reborn is not the integral form. That doesn't get reborn. Doesn't have any echo. Its truth is in what it is. Forms, in order to be forms, must be formal. And part of their formality is that they end. A mythic form, in order to be mythic, must always have a beginning, a middle, and an end. A mythic language form always has an existence which can be charted, as in a plot line. How does the plot go? Where does it begin? To what complications does it extend? And where does it end? So that mythic language always speaks about creation, about the genesis of this world and the complications thereof, and the end. There's always the sense of a beginning, a middle, and an end. So that when one looks at the Bible, mythically, it begins with Genesis and ends with the Apocalypse. And all the other books are the developments in between. That's the plot line of the Bible. But completely distinct and different from that is magical language. Magical language does not concern itself with the form, beginning, middle, and the end. It doesn't seek to track plot lines at all. It doesn't care about beginnings and endings. It cares about infinities. It cares about eternity. It cares about impossibly real theatrical dimensions that nevertheless swirl and occur, and sometimes don't occur, and that's just as interesting. So that differential forms are not definable. They have no identity. A person, an artist, a spirit is a differential form. If it finds an identity, the identity is a mask. Someone asked William Faulkner once in a seminar at the University of Virginia, innocently, she asked him, "Mr. Faulkner, what's your favorite work of yours?" He said, "Oh, my dear, the next one." You have no identity as a person. You have instead possibility. And by going into an optical illusion where you stop looking at the identities, whether assigned or assumed, or unfulfilled, or triumphantly paraded, all of the above are irrelevant. They're extraneous to you. Your you-ness is of indefinite resonance, so that you have a taste for intervals being satisfying. When you take time out, or when you take a space apart, you're refreshed. It's the quality of being able to appreciate the open-ended, so that a differential form, an artist, someone who is their person, does not fill a list of specs, no matter how cleverly and extensively delineated. You're not able to be reduplicated by a recipe, no matter how sophisticated it is. You are at each and every time originally, spontaneously new. And that there is no limit to this. How does the more mature Emily Dickinson write it? "I cannot see my soul, but know 'tis there, nor ever saw his house, nor furniture, who has invited me with him to dwell. But a confiding guest consult as well, what raiment honor him the most, that I be adequately dressed, for he ensures to none, lest men special adorn, procuring him perpetual dressed, by dating it a sudden feast." It's always, not only now is deceptively here, but the here that she's talking about has no dimensional boundary whatsoever. It's always there, but never here. She writes, "The spirit lasts, but in what mode? Below, the body speaks, but as the spirit furnishes. Apart, it never talks. The music in the violin does not emerge alone, but arm in arm with touch, yet touch alone is not a tune. The spirit lurks within the flesh, like tides within the sea, that make the water live. Estranged, what would they either be? Does that know now, or does it cease? That too this is done? resuming at a mutual date with every future one? Instinct pursues the adamant, exacting this reply: adversity, if it may be, or wild prosperity. The rumor's gate was shut so tight before my mind was sown, not even a prognostic's push could make a dent thereon. In very late Hellenistic wisdom, the iconography of imagery that was chosen to describe the spiritual universe was that it was a jeweled matrix. The hard noun that positioned itself was adamantine. It was not adamantine, which means jewel-like hard so that nothing can scratch it. Nothing could scratch it, not because of a hardness like a ruby or a diamond, but because of an emptiness that didn't receive scratches no matter what it was, no matter how sharp. It was adamantine because it was sealed in perpetual eternal openness. Now, it was very difficult for human beings to understand this. It was extremely scarce and rare. And one of the most difficult qualities of appreciating this was that the ball of realization that permitted this to happen bounced back and forth between East and West for thousands of years. And in the times that it was not there in the East, it was there in the West. And when it was not there in the West, it was in the East. And no one was cultivated enough sufficiently for a long time to realize the game, the tennis match between this and that. And what a beautiful thing was the choreography of the whole match. No one could calibrate set point for a long time in human history. The first time that it ever came together so that someone could appreciate this was in Alexandria about 2,000 years ago. It was the first time that someone could be cultivated enough, sophisticated enough, East and West, to understand this magnificent magisterial play of discovery, insight, the ball of realization. We characteristically identify India as the home of the yogis. India has the yogis. India never had yogis until the yoga was carried there from Egypt. Never. Try it. Read the Rig Veda. Where are the yogis? When you look at the artifacts from Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, from the Harappan civilization of ancient India of 4,500 years ago, you don't find that. Where you find it first, pristinely, 5,000 years ago, is in Egypt, the original Egypt. The first monks were ancient Egyptians. I have a beautiful photograph of a statue which is there somewhere still in Berlin of an Egyptian monk from about 4,000 years ago, walking in linen cloth collected around the waist, and walking with that kind of graceful quality, bare-chested, shaved head quality that one finds later on characteristically in Thai Buddhas. It's Egyptian, not Indian at all. The Indian yogis are late on the scene. The Indian yogis come from a time when the Vedas in all their layered versions, not just Rig Veda and Atharva Veda and Yajur Veda and all the Vedas, have all filigrated the society so that it was like a lace doily of compartmentalization. It was then that yoga was born in India. It was then that part of the quality of the pattern of life is that when you got to be an old man, you left town and went to the mountains, went to the forest to sit it out the last days. And out of that comes the Upanishads, which is the original yoga in India, which is thousands of years after it appears in Egypt. So in their egotistical hubris of Indians coming to teach the West about yoga, they could use a little historical cultivation. It's not that hard to find someone who can teach it accurately every week. That's why the historical Buddha was so powerful, because it was the heyday of several centuries of discovering the powers of yoga and bringing it to perfection. Because from the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad of about 800 BC to the Buddha's enlightenment about 525 BC, one has this incredible development of about 3 centuries. But the ball doesn't stay in Egypt. It doesn't stay in India. It bounces back to the West. Because with the Buddha comes, it's like an epiphany. It's like a perfection point. And the yoga in India after the Buddha becomes increasingly codified, increasingly ritualized, because it worked. Because it worked so well, that was the Indian yoga. It became that kind of meditation and dharma. The ball bounces back to the West with Pythagoras. Pythagoras, who spent 22 years being schooled in the Heliopolitan recension of Egyptian wisdom, recognized when he was in Iran, in India, he recognized the ancient wisdom. And so he brought back the viable tradition that was very recognizably in the West, the ancient Egyptian tradition, but brought it with all of the Indian modifications. And so Pythagorean communities had, again, a kind of a monkish quality, but this time it had something new. For the first time, the Pythagorean version of withdrawing within applied to both men and women, because the Buddha was not a sexist. Buddha had plenty of women listeners. One of the most famous madams of the day was a very close friend of his, because he did not have a gender specificity, which was there in ancient Egypt because of the mythological conditioning. Women were important in ancient Egypt, but they were important because they were not yogis, whereas to the Buddha, gender was of no consequence whatsoever. But to Pythagoras, it isn't that gender is of no consequence. It's of consequence all over again, but in a differential way. In Pythagoras, the female yogi is markedly complementary to the male yogi. They are a reality, and they have a capacity to reach a paired resonance which exceeds perfection. India never developed this until the ball bounced back from the West, back to India. It bounced back to India from the West after long, long centuries. And when it came back to the West in Pythagoras and got this sexual complementarity to it, it took about 500 years to perfect it in the West. And it came to a sharp, perfected point in the Alexandria of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Whoa, but a lot of guys didn't want to hear it. Women yogis? And two of the most prejudiced men against women realizers were Peter and Paul, for completely different reasons. We don't want to hear about it, they said in two different accents. And when that was carried, that pristine resonance was carried back to India by St. Thomas, it hit a pool of latent yogic talent that took several centuries to mature and develop, and out of that came the Tantra. Not in Tibet, not in China, not in Japan, no, not in northern India. It came from Orissa, over on the Bay of Bengal. That's where Tantra was born. It came from that tremendous development, the Gupta dynasty in India, that was seeking to find some way to develop the transcendental forms of consciousness. And they realized that one of the most characteristic regressions was for the super yogi to get a super ego. Not a Freudian superego, but larger than universal ego. The kind of, I have to use a Jewish term here, the kind of chutzpah that allows you to teach others to develop versions of yourself. The guru, who, as Krishnamurti said one time late in his life, he said, I am disheartened to learn that my countrymen are not only collecting shekels, but disciples. The guru who collects disciples better have an audit, because there's such a thing as a realistic tax collector. Karmic overdue payments are going to be required, because the ball's in the West now, not in the East. There are no Taoists in China. There are no real yogis in India. What's important to our concern today in this interval is that Emily Dickinson was like Master Super Yogi who heard without any words and yet was able to take the hearing without any words and put them into words. So that the words, instead of conveying reference that were egotistical, conveyed possibilities that were spiritual. The meanings of her words were the possibilities of your understanding. So that the reader, the hearer of Emily Dickinson, the more that they grow, the more that those words flower. It's what you bring to that performance is where the art is. If you play a Bartok chamber piece for people who cannot hear it, there's not much art there. But for people who have an ear and can hear that, there's quite an extraordinary artistic performance that has happened. If one plays a piece by Alan Hovhaness for a generation that doesn't even have a book on him, even though he's almost 90 years old. First time out, they're trying to compartmentalize by habitual ears what cannot be heard. And only by opening and unplugging the habituation of expected musical form does one get surprised that your participation is the top musician in the whole ensemble. That the more that you are able to hear possibility, the more Hovannes is a composer of that music. A music which is in its actuality, its reality, a complementarity between hearing and performing. No guru in India even understands that yet, much less could write it. It used to be in the Buddha's ancient India time that you would go into debates. Yogis would meet and they would have debates, and whoever had the outcome of that, then they would go to school at the other's feet. Well, the 21st century is going to be open season on phony gurus. Now, they better read up. Now, they better get their meditation honed. In Emily Dickinson, there's a quality that would be unique except for the fact that she lived not too many miles away from Henry David Thoreau. And when one looks at Thoreau's life, at his person, you get suddenly shocked when you get some of the data, when you get some of the chronological facts which then reveal to you the beginnings of a history. The history of the man, the history of the region. Here in Los Angeles, actually in San Marino, at the Huntington Library, they have the original manuscripts of Thoreau's translations of Aeschylus, done when he was 19 years old at Harvard. He left Harvard because he was bored at 19. I'm talking about he translated some of the most difficult classical Greek imaginable at 19. He also read Icelandic. He also read many other things. He was not like a lucky guy. He was super intellectual. Do you get it? He came from that environment that Emily Dickinson came from. But Thoreau was like a differential explosion after the implosion of Emerson. Emerson is someone who understood nature's integral spectacle to a T and was able to bring it all together and then transcendentally let it go. And Thoreau is someone who started from where Emerson let it go and went on eternally, infinitely. Emerson, in his private library, had more volumes on Goethe than anyone else. If you look at the book that's a listing of Emerson's library, he had over 130 books on and about Goethe. He read German. He corresponded with Carlyle because both of them were Goetheites. He loved Kant and Goethe. He loved the German idealists, the transcendentalism that comes from Kant and all of that, the romantic transcendentalism. And Thoreau had no taste for it at all. Thoreau had very small little library. He said once, after he got the returns from his book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, that didn't sell, but I think 13 copies. He wrote in his diary, he said, "I now have a library of over 1,000 volumes, 987 of which I've written myself." Thoreau was a pencil maker. He used to make pencils. Can you imagine the ironical yogi discipline of making pencils for other people to write when you're Henry David Thoreau? Yeah. But an Englishman who loved the wild, open qualities of Thoreau sent him a copy of the Asian classics. Many volumes in a big box, and he opened this box, and out popped the Bhagavad Gita and the Rig Veda and all the Taoist material, and Thoreau was ecstatic. They were pals, they were friends. He could read the Bhagavad Gita walking with a sandwich in one hand through the forest and get it. Bhagavan Vyasa was a pal, not distant yogi that you need Harvard professors to do monographs on Ramayana and Yamuna in order to get back far enough that you could understand this difficult yogic text. It was an afternoon's friendship for the time he was reading. But Thoreau understood the wilder shores. He lived in an early 19th century United States, very near to the Canadian borders, where the Indian traditions of the primordial New World were still alive. As a boy, he used to find arrowheads in the backyard. Not because he lived spectacularly on some Indian site through some synchronicity, but because the entire landscape of North America was covered with the artifacts of thousands of years of North American Indian civilization. People today forget it. They don't understand it. They don't get that North America was a wilderness which had been returned back to nature by the Indian inhabitants through wisdom. That they had been here so many tens of thousands of years that the literal effects of their material civilization literally peppered the continent. One of the very few books that really understood that kind of North America was a book named by a man who had the same name as the actor, Walter Pidgeon, published in 1840. I have a copy of it. In his old age, he wrote down the traditions of De Kuda. De Kuda, who was a Fox Indian from a territory called Wisconsin, who took Pidgeon around in the early part of the 19th century, the early 1800s, and told him the meanings of the mounds, the different kinds of mounds, the effigy mounds, the geometric mounds, and told him that from the Atlantic seaboard past the Mississippi River, up into northern Canada, down into southern Texas and New Mexico, that the entire landscape was a tattoo of contiguous Indian structures. The whole land was sacred, was embossed by the symbols of conscious understanding. And it was on this hidden, invisible tapestry that people like Thoreau and Emily Dickinson penetrated through the thin veneer of European play acting. And the first time that Thoreau got it, he went to his friend, his older friend Emerson, and he asked him if he could have the rental of a little piece of land alongside Walden Pond, which Emerson owned. that he wanted to go on an American Indian vision quest, and that he was going to build his wilderness version of the sweat lodge, which was the cabin, the little cabin that he built there at Walden Pond. And Walden is a conscious version of the American Indian vision quest. Not a ritual version, but an artistic version. The book Walden displaces the ritual by art, by conscious, visionary, infinite personal art. Emily Dickinson never talked to anybody about her writing. Who was there to talk to? She couldn't even recognize limitations to herself enough to be someone who could then talk. Who would be doing the talking? In 1858, she began to realize that her poems linked. Her poems linked. They linked together, and that they were curves. They were curves that lifted off the page of the plane geometry of Cartesian surfaced minds that are satisfied with cookie-cutter shapes of self and other. She lifted completely off the page, and she realized that if she put the poems together and she began taking sheets of paper and folding them and carefully sewing like an embroiderer the edges, and she made fascicles, and she began binding her poems into fascicles in 1858. And all of her poetry, to the end of her life in 1886, were written on sheets that were then folded and gathered. In fact, in publishing, they call them F&Gs still today. Fascicles was her term because it was a term that was used in the American English of that day. Actually, the Renaissance term for that kind of form was not that they were fascicles, but that they were signatures. Hence, when you gather them all together and you bind them, it's called signature bound. But the Renaissance magical understanding of signature is an alchemical term. It means a conscious form where natural reference are tied into an infinity bow. And that the alchemical structure of things is not the bones of the things, but that the bones of the things are turned inside out. Like a shaman who wears the bones on the outside of his body, not on the inside, has been turned inside out. It's an early way of talking about differential openness. Instead of the skeleton being inside, the skeleton, you're turned completely inside out. And that all alchemical structure is like that. Everything that is can be pulled inside out, and when it's pulled inside out, its symbolic structure becomes the signature of the thing. And if you write, the symbolic structure of things, they respond to that and they become that. They become transformed. So that a mystic like Jacob Boehme, who writes a book called The Signature of All Things, says that if you know the language of God, if you know how to write the hieroglyphics of the alchemical transformative structure of them, they will transform instantly, spontaneously, when shown their signature. How do you know someone? Because you see their signature. You see the signature. You see the spiritual structure disclosed. It's this kind of depth that one needs to appreciate the incredible challenge of history, which is coming up next for us as early as next Saturday. History is an oceanic acid that dissolves bodies and minds. They haven't got one chance in all eternity of surviving that. But the spirit swims in the water in which they drowned. The spirit is at home in history, because history is a parallel to its birth medium, which is vision. And history and vision are differential oceans, differential processes. And if you try the old rituals in face of historical challenges, you're going to end up ridiculous. Practicing the out-of-date yogas of a time that didn't even originate the techniques in a later time, when completely new, spontaneous processes of openness, new possibilities are what is required by the challenge. The response of replying with feathers and postures is only what it is. Tar and feathers and posturings. That's all that it is. Emily Dickinson, rather than being married to Henry David Thoreau, though, has a real pal at the ultimate apex of Asian civilization. When the integrative inside-outness of differential openness resonated throughout Asia from the time of the Guptas in 500, 600 India, and resonated across East Asia. It came to rest 1,000 years later in Japan in the personality of Matsuo Basho, who we've had already. And Basho is a samurai with words. He used phrases like a Kurosawa hero would flash a sword. You don't even see it. It's so fast. His alchemical, shamanistic journals, The Records of a Weather-Exposed Skeleton is the title of one of them. The Records of a Travel-Worn Satchel is another. Here's two haiku. He invented the haiku form. Emily Dickinson is a haiku writer in Old New England. Here's Basho. This is from Records of a Weather-Exposed Skeleton. The ancient poet who pitied monkeys for their cries, what would he say if he saw this child crying in the autumn wind? The ancient poet was Tu Fu, the great Tang Chinese poet. The poem is a poem of his called Climbing Taishan. They don't say here, probably the translator doesn't even realize it. At the beginning of Climbing Taishan, Taishan was one of the 5 sacred mountains of China. 5. The Taoist energy cycle is 5. So there are 5 mountains in China that you made pilgrimages to and you climbed. And the Taoist understanding was always that the center is repeated twice. 1, 2, center, 3, 4, center. And if you don't have that conscious pretzel, you didn't tie the bow of openness. Instead, you tied the knot of superego. And you become crusading yogi, collecting shekels and disciples and fame, and who knows. Tu Fu, in the beginning of his poem, Climbing Taishan, which is the most mystical of all the mountains, because it was the mountain that only in ancient times the emperor could climb to perform the Feng and Shui ceremonies that inaugurated the dynasty. On the top of the mountain, he would perform the feng ceremonies, that is, getting the feng is the phoenix, showing that one has come back, that the dynasty collapsed, that history was over, but that someone conscious brought it back into a rebirth at the top of the mountain. And only the emperor in his spiritual person could do that alone. That's what made him divine. He could do that. And then he went back down to the base of the mountain, like Moses coming down from Sinai, bringing the tablets, and then giving the impress of that divine order, the mandate of heaven, to the people and to the kingdom. And that was the Shui ceremony. So it's the sacred ordination was that, and Taishan was that mountain. And in Tufu's poem, Climbing, he says that he gets into this torrential verticality. This Taoist verticality of realizing that you are soaring consciously above whatever plane of human reference there was. And he hears in the far distance the cry of apes, wild apes in the jungle. And he, by implication, realizes how differentially, universally, eternally different he is from them. He's not related to apes at all anymore. He's related to the divine soaring into infinity. That's what he's related to. That's what Basho is saying here. Aside from the human poignancy of a baby being left to cry, probably desolate in autumn, he's referring to how when you leave your ego behind, you still compassionately hear it crying alone in the autumnal dimensions of time-space. And that's where compassion comes in. That's why one goes back. Agrees to go back. Otherwise, to what would you go back, and who is there that would go back? The other poem, in the sun, on a cold winter day, my shadow had frozen stiff on horseback. Emily Dickinson has this kind of quality. A word dropped careless on a page may stimulate an eye when folded in perpetual seam, the wrinkled maker lie. Infection in the sentence breeds. We may inhale despair at distances of centuries from the malaria. Writing is not print. It's not ink on paper. It's the spiritual hieroglyphic of the signature of eternities. And when someone writes like that, we say of them that they are a poet. No one teaches that in whatever universities there may be. That you have to learn for yourself by discovery. That's how all of us learned it, by finding out. And the beginning of that was indeterminate wonder. More next week.